Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And thanks for tuning in, everyone. Yesterday, by the end of the broadcast Wednesday, I lost my internet connection. At a most inopportune time, my closing statements were cut off. And I'd been dealing with an internet connection problem for about a month, so we took measures to get that fixed. And after start time Thursday, they called and told me how to fix it myself. So we're back on the air this morning. We're going to continue where we left off Wednesday on the broadcast. We were speaking, by the way, for the refresher, we're reading from John Dowling's book entitled The History of Romanism. No book in my library will more convince you that the Church of Antichrist is the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, and the Papacy is the man of sin. This is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it to my listeners. You can read it right along with me online if you care to. It's archives.org. Go to archives.org and punch in the title, Romanism and the History of Romanism, or rather just Google the title and pick out the selection for archive.org. But for most of you, I highly recommend that you just close your eyes, empty your mind, and listen to my reading and discussion of the book. And I think you'll retain more of it. Now, we were speaking Wednesday about 366 A.D. This is the first chapter of the book. It's from the embryonic beginnings of the papacy until 606 A.D. This is chapter 1 of the book. We're currently on page 35. And we're talking about a period of time early in the so-called Christian era, 366 A.D. And at this time, what is known as the papacy today, or the Pope, was just a bishop of bishops, okay? Just like every other bishop. But in order to grow into the abominable antichrist monstrosity that it is today, that lowly Bishop of Rome had to claw and dig his way to preeminence. And that took a great deal of time. It took a great deal of time for the man of sin, the son of perdition, to fully grow to maturity, to the mature status that it has obtained in our day and generation. But in 366 A.D., the Bishop of Rome was just a simple bishop. But in 366, the current Pope at the time, or rather Bishop of Rome at the time's name was Liberius, okay? And he kicked the bucket, so the Roman Church had to elect another bishop. And it was the people's job to do that. And at this time there arose two candidates for the position of bishop, a highly coveted position because of the wealth and splendor and power and authority of the bishop. There was a great deal of infighting and intrigue and criminality involved with electing another bishop. And so on this occasion, one faction elected a man by the name of Damasus to the papacy, or rather to the bishopric of Rome, while the opposing party chose Ursicinus, a deacon of the Roman Church, to succeed Liberius. This double election gave rise to a dangerous schism and to a sort of civil war within the city of Rome, which was carried on with the utmost barbarity and fury and produced the most cruel massacres and desolations. Now, this here is obvious evidence that the Church of Rome is not a Christian church. It never was. It never will be. And the same civil war occurs at every election of the Pope, but they've taken it out of the public realm in order to stop this bloodshed, and they placed it behind closed doors at the Vatican, and supposedly the College of Cardinals elects the Pope. The people have no say in it anymore. But let me tell you, the Civil War still rages with each election of a pope, and it's held behind closed doors, and it's within the College of Cardinals. And it's protected behind the closed doors at the Vatican, so the scandal that takes place every time a pope is elected is not viewed by the world. And so it's still the same character that it was in this early day. But this election amounted to a civil war among the Romans. Now, you must understand that this is not the way a Christian church behaves, and not because they were just simply misbehaving Christians. They weren't Christians at all. Okay? Now, in this disgraceful contest, which ended in the victory of Damasus, according to the historian Socrates, great numbers were murdered on either side. No less than 137 persons being destroyed in the very church itself. Okay? We're not talking about the total number of people who died in this civil war. There were at least 137 people who died in the Roman Catholic Church there in Rome, in the church itself. Okay? Now, the author asks the obvious question. Who does not perceive in these wicked strifes and sanguinary struggles a proof that now that which quote-unquote let or hindered was taken out of the way, the full revelation of the predicted man of sin was rapidly hastening onward? Okay? This alone, the author is insinuating, and I agree, is proof positive that hindrance was taken out of the way and the man of sin was finally revealed. Okay? What kept the church pristine in its very beginnings was the relentless persecution of the saints. And once Constantine took over the church and made Rome the center of Christendom, the persecution stopped. And now everybody wants to be a member of this state-sponsored church called Christianity. And not only that, but they want to war and fight over who gets to be the bishop of that abomination. Fighting and warring over power and influence and authority, and that's what it devolved in. The restraint was gone. And so now the man of sin is fully revealed. It's none other than the Bishop of Rome, the Papacy. Constantine created a monster, an antichrist monster. It's not the church that Jesus built, it's the church that Constantine built. It's the Antichrist church predicted by Daniel, Paul, and John. Now we'll continue. He says, while such an example of worldly pride and domination was set by those who were looked up to as the heads of the church, that is, the bishops of Rome, it's not surprising that other bishops partook the same spirit. Okay? A spirit of competition, a spirit of war, competition and war, claiming power that Christ did not give the bishop. Okay? This is a different governmental structure than the one Christ gave through his apostles. Now he says, as an instance of their haughty bearings toward earthly kings and rulers, it is related that Martin, Bishop of Tours in France, that in the year 455, he was invited to dine with the Emperor Maximus. When the cup of wine was presented to the emperor by the servant, he directed that the cup of wine should first be offered to the bishop, expecting, of course, that then he should receive it from the hand of Martin. Instead of this, however, Martin handed the cup to a priest of inferior rank who sat near him, thus by his rudeness intimating that he regarded him as of higher dignity than of the emperor. Now we have the first sign that the Bishop of Rome is now challenging the authority of the emperor, simply by who gets to present the wine. This is in the Roman world a sign of hierarchy, okay, a sign of authority. Now, Martin didn't want to receive the cup from the hand of the emperor, because that would have been a sign of Martin's inferiority to the emperor. Martin wanted it the other way around. He wanted to present himself as the superior of the emperor himself. Now, sometime after this, the queen, that is the emperor's wife, asked her husband, the king's consent that she might be allowed, in the character of the servant, to wait on the bishop at supper, and strange to say, her request was granted. So here this little political charade is continuing now. He says, for this conduct, according to the superstitious notions of the time, Sulpicius, the biographer of Martin, the Bishop of Rome, compares her to the Queen of Sheba. Okay? So this would have been the greatest of insults, to have the king's wife, the queen, wait on Martin, the Bishop of Rome. It would have been a great insult to the Bishop of Rome. So they make the queen out to be some sort of Queen of Sheba, like she was of greater authority and rank and superiority than the king himself, than the emperor himself, in order to bolster the image of the bishop over the emperor. Now it says, a Roman Catholic historian, referring to this bishop, uses the following language, quote, the great Saint Martin, the glory and light of Gaul, was a disciple of Saint Hilary. The utter extirpation of idolatry out of the diocese of Tours and all that part of Gaul was the fruit of his edifying piety, illustrious miracles, zealous labors, and fervent exhortations and instructions. He was remarkable for his humility, charity, austerity, and all other heroic virtues, unquote. So you can see how the Roman Catholic historians build up St. Martin, this so-called saint, the Bishop of Rome, and make him something that he wasn't. But here, the king insisted that this so-called St. Martin was inferior to him. So this is the beginning of the struggle between the Bishop of Rome and the government. Okay, now we see in the world today the papacy, which clawed its way up from just a simple bishop in the Roman Church to King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's the full-blown antichrist status of the papacy as we see it today. But in 455 A.D., there was no such thing. Okay? Now, concluding this portion, it says, certainly this historian, to say the least, must have had singular notions about what constitutes true Christian humility. So, obviously, an exaggeration of this swiveling demon, and that's what the world participates in today, bolstering the status of the papacy to godlike status, when in fact it's Antichrist itself, the man of sin, the son of perdition. Now, who are we going to believe? We're going to believe the press? We're going to believe the television cameras? Are we going to believe all the kings of the earth that bow before his presence and kiss his ring? Or are we going to believe the Scripture and history? I prefer Scripture and history to prove that the papacy is nothing in this world. Nothing except what man has elevated it to be. God did not create the papacy. God does not elevate the papacy. God names the papacy as the Antichrist of the Bible, and we better believe it. Now, we're at top of page 36. This is chapter 3. It's titled Steps Toward Papal Supremacy. We're continuing the growing of the papacy throughout history. This is subsection 11, if you're following along. And it says, nothing could be more simple and unpretending than the form of church government, of church organization and church government in primitive times. Okay? We're talking about now about the church that Jesus built. Okay? Shifting gears. We're comparing and contrasting the early church, the pristine church of Jesus Christ, the apostolic church, and we're comparing it with that which is thought to be Christianity today, the Roman Catholic Church. It says, each church consisted of a company of believers in the Lord Jesus, united together in covenant relationship for the worship of God, the maintenance of gospel doctrines, and the due administration of the ordinances appointed by Christ. Quote, every church, says Waddington, an Episcopalian, in the management of its internal affairs was essentially independent of every other, unquote. So we have early recognition that every church was independent and under Christ. Okay? Christ is the head of the church and we are all brethren. That was the hierarchy. That was the organizational structure of the early apostolic church. Now it says the same historian adds that, quote, the churches formed a sort of federative body of independent religious communities dispersed through the greater part of the empire in continual communication and in constant harmony with each other, unquote. Now, what has it become? All right, another author says, another historian, Mosheim, says, quote, the rulers of the church, Mosheim says, a Lutheran, he says, quote, were either presbyters, that is, elders, or bishops, which two titles are in the New Testament undoubtedly applied to the same order of men. See Acts chapter 20, verse 17 and 28, and Philippians chapter 1, verse 1. So this historian, Mosheim, tells us that presbyter and bishop literally mean the same thing, just two words to describe the same thing. And they were the elders of the church. Okay? We're talking about the organizational structure, the governmental structure of the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, he says, or the author says, these were persons of eminent gravity, and such as had distinguished themselves by their superior sanctity and merit. Quote, let none, says the same learned author, that's Mosheim, let none confound the bishops of this primitive and golden period of the church with those of whom we read in the following pages. For though they were both distinguished by the same name, that is, bishop, yet they differed extremely, and that in many respects. A bishop during the 1st and 2nd centuries, that is, during the church that Jesus built, was a person who had the care of one Christian assembly. Okay? There was one bishop over every single church. Every church had its bishop. They were independent of one another, and Christ was the head of all. Okay? He says a bishop during this 1st and 2nd century was a person who had the care of one Christian assembly, not many, but one, which at that time was, generally speaking, small enough to be contained in a private house, unquote. Okay? The original church of Jesus Christ met in houses, private houses. So you know the churches must have been small, and over each one presided a bishop, and he was simply an elder, a presbyter, a helper for the church. Okay? Thus, when writing to the Colossians, the Apostle Paul sends a salutation to Nymphas and says, quote, the church which is in his house, unquote. chapter 4, verse 15. In the commencement of the epistle to the Philippians, he refers to the officers of these primitive churches when he directs his letter, quote, to all the saints in Jesus Christ which are at Philippi with the bishops and deacons, unquote. This is recorded chapter 1, verse 1. Now, subsection 12 says, in the process of time, however, the beautiful simplicity of the primitive churches was abandoned, and the independence of each particular church was lost. Okay, they were no longer independent. And as we have already seen, a variety of church dignitaries, that is, more church offices than just deacons or bishops, were created in the place of the primitive elders or bishops of the apostolic age. And as this change constituted the foundation stone upon which the structure of papal assumption was afterward reared, I shall relate in the words of two distinguished historians the account of this first step in this pernicious invocation. So we have the inordinate addition of more offices, that is, more rulers within the church than the ones that Christ established. This is the beginning of the great falling away that leads us to the Roman Catholic Church and what it is today. Listen, if you're going to operate your church like the first century church, you have small groups that meet privately in private homes that has one among its members who is well read in the Scriptures, full of wisdom, and intends to be a servant of the church. That is an elder, a bishop, and he has a rightful place in the church as a servant of the church. And there are no other offices in the pristine house of God. And what has grown out of this additional layers upon layer upon layer upon layer of church government is the monstrosity we know today. And isn't it amazing that the Protestants, even during the time of the Reformation, didn't revert to the original organizational and governmental structure of the church, but maintained that system of government that they learned from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? One of the errors of the so-called Protestant Reformation. They weren't completely reformed. They left a little Roman leaven in the Protestant lump, and now, today, the Protestant lump is thoroughly contaminated. And this is one of the other things that leads to the so-called ecumenical movement to return to the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, they should have restored the pristine worship and organizational structure of the church at the time of the Protestant Reformation. Now, it has been seen from Dr. Mosheim and others that according to the New Testament usage, the title bishop belonged to presbyters or elders, okay, senior members of the congregation. Soon after the death of the apostles, however, this title began to be claimed exclusively by such as sought preeminence over their brethren in the ministry. In other words, they didn't want to be helpers of the church, highly qualified servants of the church. They wanted to exercise preeminence over their brethren. This is called Nicolaitism, okay? Lording it over the laity. Its power and influence. It has corrupted the Church of Jesus Christ. And we need to abandon it swiftly and without apology. Now, Mosheim, the historian, tells us how the early church was structured. I can't help but hearken back to a day in antiquity when all of the then known world was ruled by a single ruler. His name was Nimrod. And he singularly directed all the people to build a tower that would reach unto heaven. In other words, they wanted to elevate Nimrod to godlike status, didn't they? Nimrod had gotten control of and directed the efforts of all kinds of people, a world full of people. And he brought them to war against the very throne of Almighty God. Now, in response to this blasphemous effort, God simply confounded the languages of the people and scattered them. By changing their languages into the various languages, they could no longer communicate. He scattered them to make it much more difficult for any Antichrist to gather up all the people and to get them to go to war against God again. Christ structured his church that way. They were scattered. Little house churches all over, led by a Bible-believing, God-fearing, well-read bishop. Each house church was led by a bishop. And he didn't lead so much as help the church, guided and directed. And every church was independent of one another, so that no modern-day Nimrod could unite all the people into a single effort to defy God. This is our insurance policy from heaven. Break us up into little fragments, little churches all over the place, led by a Spirit-filled bishop. And obviously, I would choose one that knew who the Antichrist is, for heaven's sakes. And none of us would serve the papacy today. We would all know the truth. But that's not what God's people are prepared to do. They don't want independence. They want servitude. They want slavery under one ecclesiastical head. First, they united all the churches into denominations, and then they elected heads of each of those denominations, and then they took the heads of each of these denominations and lumped them all into the World Council of Churches. And guess who presides over the World Council of Churches? The modern-day Nimrod, the papacy. So there is great benefit in abandoning all of this extra-biblical, top-down, top-heavy organizational structure and return to the independent worship of Christ in house churches, led by a godly man. And then the Bishop of Rome will have no influence over us, will he? We'll have our own influence from heaven, and we'd be better prepared to fight a war against Christ's rival. Okay? It has been seen from Dr. Mosheim and others that according to the New Testament usage, the title bishop belonged to presbyters or elders. Soon after the death of the apostles, however, this title began to be claimed exclusively by such as sought preeminence over their brethren in the ministry. The words in which Geisler, an historian, relates this change are as follows, quote, "After the death of the apostles and the pupils of the apostles, to whom the general direction of the churches had always been conceded, someone amongst the presbyters of each church was suffered gradually to take the lead in its affairs." Okay? This simply means the people of the churches were no longer ready to accept their own responsibility. They appointed a leader. They established a hierarchy of the bishops, right? And it says in the same irregular way the title bishop was appropriated to the first presbyter. Hence the different accounts of the order of the first bishops in the Church of Rome, unquote. Mosheim's account of the gradual assumption of authority by these early bishops and of the early loss of the primitive independency of the churches is as follows, quote, "The power and jurisdiction of the bishops were not long confined to their original narrow limits, but soon extended themselves, and that by the following means. The bishops who lived in the cities had either by their own ministry or that of their presbyters erected new churches in the neighboring towns and villages. These churches, continuing under the inspection and ministry of the bishops, by whose labors and counsels they had been engaged to embrace the gospel, grew imperceptibly into ecclesiastical provinces. Okay? You might think of a province as a county or a state, as we see in the governmental structure of the United States. The churches established their own jurisdictions. Okay? Every judicial system needs a jurisdiction. Okay? In the government of Jesus Christ, every church was a jurisdiction, and over it was an independent bishop. And he wasn't a lord over the church, he was a servant. But as the restraint left, the churches got bigger and bigger and bigger, and of course many more churches, and so they had to break up. They felt that they had to break up the land into dioceses or provinces and appoint over this region a diocesan archbishop. Okay? So we see the government getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It says these churches, continuing under the inspection and ministry of the bishops, by whose labors and counsels they had engaged to embrace the gospel, grew imperceptibly into ecclesiastical provinces. This is a government entity, which the Greeks afterward called dioceses. Okay? You won't find the word diocese in the Bible. You'll find churches in the Bible, but not dioceses. Simply because there was no such thing, God intended there to be no such thing as jurisdictional territories ruled over by a single man. Okay? Now it says the churches in these early times were entirely independent, none of them subject to any foreign jurisdiction, but each one governed by its own rulers and its own laws. Okay? Every church established its own rules and regulations. They were all supposedly led by the Holy Spirit. They were all independent. They were all separate, yet all under Christ. Christ was the head of the church, and they were all brethren. All right? And it says, for though the churches founded by the apostles had this particular deference shown them, that they were consulted in different and doubtful cases, yet they had no jurisdictional authority, no sort of supremacy over the others, nor the least right to enact laws for them. So what is a diocese? It's like a county, a considerable area of land. It's created for the purpose to elevate a diocesan dictator who makes all the laws. Okay? All the laws governing the church. Now, if that be a Roman Catholic dictator over a geographical area of the land called a diocese, what about God-fearing, Bible-believing Christians that live within that diocese? They, too, must conform to the laws and rules and regulations of the church. This is called the civil power. The civil power gets its power and strength from the beast, doesn't it? This is what we learned from James A. Wiley in his book Roman Civil Liberty. That these dioceses are Rome's governmental structure. The Vatican's jurisdictional control over every man, woman, and child that lives within that diocese, whether he be Roman Catholic or not. These rules and regulations are adopted by the civil state and imposed upon everyone equally. This is how we are all made to serve the beast. We don't serve Christ, we serve the beast in Rome. We are under his jurisdictional authority within the diocese in which we live. This was revealed to us by James A. Wiley in his writings. I call it the shadow government. That which you see on television, Washington, D.C., is the visible government. The invisible government is every diocese and every diocesan priest. And he's lorded over by archbishops and by cardinals and eventually by the Pope. So this counterfeit, antichrist, organizational church structure fashioned by Rome is global now, and the Protestants have lost this understanding. And they're unwitting dupes to the papacy. They are unwitting servants of the papacy. And this is how this whole system began, through the establishment of ecclesiastical provinces, church provinces called dioceses. Now, the churches in those early times were entirely independent, none of them subject to any foreign jurisdiction, no dioceses back then, but each one governed by its own rulers and its own laws. Okay? Simple. For though the churches founded by the apostles had this particular deference shown them, that they were consulted in difficult and doubtful cases, yet they had no judicial authority, no sort of supremacy over the others, nor the least right to enact laws for them. Nothing, on the contrary, is more evident than the perfect equality that reigned among the primitive churches, nor does there even appear in the first century the smallest trace of that association of provincial churches from which councils and metropolitans derive their origin. Okay? So now we have two more layers of governmental structure coming out of this perversion, this diocesan perversion, called councils and metropolitans. Did you know you're under the councils and metropolitans of the Roman Catholic Church wherever you live in this country? Well, you do now. And they are the ones who write the laws. They are the ones who submit their laws to the Pope for ratification, which becomes Roman Catholic canon law, and then language is written down in civil legislation and proposed and sent to Congress for passage, and if it passes, it puts you and me and everyone in this country under Roman authority. That's how our civil government works. It is the instrument by which and through which the papacy makes us all servants to him. The civil laws of this land are nothing but Roman Catholic canon law written so as to disguise the origin of these laws. You see how far this perversion has gotten? You think you're an independent church? You're not. Now, quote, during great part of the 2nd century, the Christian churches were independent of each other, nor were they joined together by association, confederacy, or any other bonds but those of charity. Each Christian assembly was a little state governed by its own laws, which were either enacted or at least approved by the society. But in the process of time, all the Christian churches of a province were formed into one large ecclesiastical body, which, like confederate states, assembled at certain times in order to deliberate about the common interests of the whole. This institution had its origin among the Greeks, with whom nothing was more common than this confederacy of independent states and the regular assemblies which met, in consequence thereof, at fixed times, and were composed of the deputies of each respective state. But these ecclesiastical associations were not long confined to the Greeks. Their great utility was no sooner perceived than they became universal and were formed in all places where the gospel had been planted. To these assemblies, in which the deputies or commissioners of several churches consulted together, the name of synods was appropriated by the Greeks, and that of councils by the Latins, that is, by the Romans. And the laws that were enacted in these general meetings were called canons, or rules. So you see how the governmental structure of the church devolved and into synods and councils. The Greeks called them synods, the Romans called them councils, and this is where the laws are written, in the synods and the councils. This is where the Church of Antichrist writes the laws for every land. Now, these councils, of which we find not the smallest trace before the middle of the 2nd century, changed the whole face of the church and gave it a new form. For by them the ancient privileges of the people were considerably diminished, and the power and authority of the bishops greatly augmented. Okay? So the independency of the churches were lost. Power and authority was given to each bishop to lord it over the people, and he joined these synods and councils, and the hair of the Antichrist got bigger and bigger and bigger, while at the same time the importance of the saints, the true people of God, was diminished. This is how we lost power. This is how we lost power in the churches. Okay? Do you feel like you have any say in your church anymore? Or that by voting on an issue, it's just a token gratitude, that's not the word I want to use. Just a token deference to the people, just to satisfy them, and the church does whatever the hierarchs please in the end. That's what's created out of all of this. And he says the humility, indeed, and imprudence of these pious prelates prevented their assuming all at once the power with which they were afterward invested. At their first appearance in those general councils, they acknowledged that they were no more than the delegates of their respective churches, and that they acted in the name and by the appointment of their people. But they soon changed this humble tone, imperceptibly extended the limits of their authority, turned their influence into dominion, and their counsels into laws, and openly asserted at length that Christ had empowered them to prescribe to his people authoritative rules of faith and manners. Okay? So now we're off to the races. The Pope has his hierarchy. The people have been duly subjected to authority after authority, compounded by authority on top of authority, until that authority eventually rises to the papacy. This is the full unleashing of the restraint that Paul talked about. The restraint is completely gone. And now the man of sin is revealed. That wicked, Paul called him. It's in your face. It's every day, 24/7, 365. The visible government is just an image of the true government in Rome. Quote, another effect of these councils was the gradual abolition of that perfect equality which reigned among all bishops in the primitive times. For the order and decency of these assemblies required that some one of the provincial bishops met in council should be invested with a superior degree of power and authority, and hence the rights of metropolitans derive their origin. In the meantime, the bounds of the church were enlarged. The custom of holding councils was followed wherever the sound of the gospel had reached, and the universal church had now the appearance of one vast republic, formed by a combination of a great number of little states. This occasioned the creation of a new order of ecclesiastics, another layer of government, who were appointed in different parts of the world as heads of the church, and whose office it was to preserve the consistency and union of that immense body whose members were so widely dispersed throughout the nations. Such was the nature and office of the patriarchs, among whom at length ambition, being arrived at in its most insolent period, formed a new dignity, a brand new dignity, investing the Bishop of Rome and his successors with the title and authority of Prince of the Patriarchs. So now we have even the patriarchs, and over him, the Pope. And you've been led to believe that the man of sin is someone in the long distant future that won't be a factor in the world until just before Christ returns. Your church taught you that. Fellow Christians taught you that. But no one taught that back before the 16th century. They always believed the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist, and they watched every move that he made. The building of his dynasty, the building of his global government, the usurpation of his authority over even the princes, the kings, and the potentates of the world. The whole world has been deceived. Now, quote, the Christian doctors had the good fortune to persuade the people that the ministers of the Christian church succeeded to the character, rights, and privileges of the Jewish priesthood. That's right, Christian doctors, the most learned of the Christian churches, had the good fortune, their own good fortune, to persuade the people, that is, the saints of God, that the ministers of the Christian church should succeed to the character, rights, and privileges of the Jewish priesthood. Now you know why Jesus reviled the Jewish priesthood so when he met them face to face. They had usurped Christ's rightful throne. They had made laws so minute, like the IRS today. They had oppressed the people with a heavy yoke of bondage, spiritual bondage, physical bondage, extra-biblical laws and rules and regulations, so much, though, that like the IRS, you could be found guilty of any of these Jewish laws at any time. The people were reduced to servants of the priest, not servants of God. And when they made their confessions and put their sacrifices on the altar, they were literally making sacrifice for violating the laws of the priest, not the laws of God. The Jewish priesthood had completely replaced the government of God. They had become a government in and of unto themselves. And they became heavy taskmasters for God's people. So much so that no one could be found innocent. They were all condemned. They were all found in debt to the Jewish priesthood. And Christ came to liberate them. And he did. Liberated them from Jewish priestly tyranny. And what did we Gentiles do? Just as this author insinuates, we allowed another Jewish priesthood to ascend over us, a Roman Catholic Jewish priesthood that binds us with the same heavy burdens so that no one can be found innocent. And we are all indebted to this great Catholic Antichrist at Rome. And the governments serve him day and night, tyrannizing the people. I think it's time for us to repent, don't you? I'll see you tomorrow.